Hello and welcome to How Could We, a podcast by Climate-KIC where we explore the collaboration we need, the lessons we've learned and the areas where we see the most impact when it comes to climate action. I'm your host Anne-Sophie Garrigou, and today we're exploring what it takes to strengthen climate resilience at the regional level. Across Europe, communities are already facing the impact of climate change, from heat waves and floods to shifting seasons and strained infrastructure. And while regional and local governments are leading the majority of adaptation efforts, too often these actions are happening in isolation. That's where Pathway to Resilience come in. It's a flagship initiative under the EU Mission on Adaptation to Climate Change led by Climate-KIC. It supports over 100 regions in developing climate resilience strategies and investment plans with a strong focus on capacity building, peer learning and participatory design. The goal? To equip regions with the tools, training and connections they need to move from reactive interventions to systemic and transformative adaptation. Joining me today on the podcast is François Gemène. François is a researcher, an IPCC lead author. He's a trusted voice when it comes to the intersection of climate change, migration and geopolitics. He will support the scientific publications of the project Pathway to Resilience. In this episode, I will talk to François about what it means to support regions through long-term adaptation, why capacity building is more than just technical training, and how justice and subnational leadership must play a central role in designing resilient futures. François Gemène, welcome to How Could We podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I've said a few words in the introduction about you. Your research deals mostly with environmental and migration governance. You have worked on populations displaced by environmental changes and the policies of adaptation to climate change. I'm not going to ask you to resume your, I don't know how many decades of research in one sentence, but can you introduce us a little bit about... Yeah, exactly. Can you introduce us to your research, to maybe some of the latest things that you've worked on?
I work mostly on the human impacts of climate change, which include migration and displacement, but also issues like security, conflicts, inequalities, or development. And as a researcher, I spent quite a lot of time documenting these actual impacts of climate change with the affected communities. And one of the latest projects that we conducted, which is called Habitable, deals, as the name indicates, with the issue of habitability and how people affected by climate impacts define whether or not the place where they live is still inhabitable or not. In other words, how do they decide to stay or to leave? And what we found was quite interesting, because we found that the decision to stay or leave was based on the perceptions of climate impacts rather than on climate models or projections, of course.
Okay, so where was this research led, and how are people decided then to leave or to stay?
So we worked mostly in 5 countries, 4 African countries plus Thailand. So we worked in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Mali, and in Ghana, and we followed over a 4-year period with a large-scale survey involving about 1,000 respondents per country. We followed families, households, in their decision to stay or to leave. And what is quite flabbergasting is that the decision to stay or leave is based mostly on the way people perceive climate impact. And yet, we tend to design policies on the basis of climate models, on the basis of rational science, so to say. But people's perceptions by nature are irrational, which means that people's perceptions do not match the observations of climate impacts. And yet, the decision to migrate or to stay is based on perceptions, not on observations.
So you've already started to talk about climate adaptation policies. How do you see the relationship between climate adaptation policies and migration governance evolving in the next decade, especially in those vulnerable regions that you're studying?
We need to break away from 2 mindsets. The first one is to think that migration is a failure of adaptation, that people migrate once they failed to adapt. And research shows that in plenty of cases, people migrate not because they failed to adapt, but precisely in order to adapt, in order to alleviate the demographic pressure on natural resources, in order to bring additional income to the family, in order to diversify the skills, whatever. So that's the first, I would say, paradigm that we need to break away from. The second one is to think that the role of adaptation is to limit migration, to prevent migration. And very often we see adaptation programs that are designed especially to try and prevent migration. And some mean well, others are just about making sure that people do not move. I don't think that we can judge the success of an adaptation programs regarding whether people have migrated or not. That just doesn't work like that, and I don't think that preventing migration could or should be the purpose of an adaptation program. That can be a by-result, that can be a consequence of the adaptation program. I don't think we should have that objective in mind, because if we have that objective in mind, we're likely to miss it.
Also, something that we have to say here is that when we talk about climate migration, most of the climate migration is happening within a same country or a same region,
right?
Sure.
So even on very short distances, people do not seek to cross a border, they just seek to put themselves out of harm.
Yeah, exactly. So how can adaptation strategies be designed to avoid reinforcing existing inequalities or to avoid creating new form of displacement?
To me, the key purpose of an adaptation strategy should be to make sure that people have the choice between staying or leaving. And I think one of the worst effects of climate change will be to reduce the freedom to choose, will be to reduce the freedom to choose to stay or to choose to leave. And actually, a lot of people, at the same time that there are lots of people forced to migrate as a result of climate change, there are also lots of people forced to immobility as a result of climate change because they lack the resources, because they've lost their income, and therefore they don't have the resources that would enable them to move. To me, the challenge of adaptation is really to make sure that people have a choice between staying or leaving. And I think that should be the purpose of adaptation policies.
So that brings me to my next topic, which is linked to all of this, is the just transition. So just transition is often discussed in the context of mitigation, right? But how should we understand it in the context of adaptation, especially at the regional level? Because as at Climate-KIC, we work with regions around Europe on climate adaptation, but there is also an aspect of it that needs to be just. On how the climate adaptation strategies are developed. So how do we understand it in the context of adaptation?
I think first that you're very right to say that an adaptation strategy needs to be fair and equitable. And the problem is that many adaptation strategies are designed to protect the wealthiest segments of a population, forgetting those who cannot be protected by an adaptation strategy. And we need to keep in mind that adaptation is first and foremost about protecting people. And I see adaptation policy exactly on par with defense policy or law and order policy. It is about protecting people, and I think it should have that status within a government, whether it is a national or a municipal government. That's the first point. The second point is that from an economic viewpoint, the difficulty between mitigation and adaptation is that the economic model is not always the same. Mitigation can yield immediate benefits. There is a return on investment. Adaptation is mostly about avoiding costs. That means, especially at the local level, that it is usually easy to find private funds to fund mitigation strategies. When it comes to adaptation, typically public funds will need to actually fund the project. And at the moment, we lack public funds, which is the reason why we need to be creative, why we need to think of projects that can kill two birds with one stone. The energetic renovation of housing, for example, is a good example of that, but there are many others. And we could also imagine that people could invest locally their savings into a project that would make sense for them and that would yield a return on investment.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting what you're talking about, because in the climate narrative, climate communication bubble, we're talking now about how do we make adaptation more sexy. And it's really difficult because you don't want to make it only about profit, only about business, right? It is about people, as you're saying. So there is a whole conversation
Absolutely.
on how to make it, how do people understand, businesses and governments understand that this is about avoiding cost, as you're saying.
The first point, I think, is to stop considering adaptation as the admission of a defeat. And at least here in France, where adaptation is gaining currency in public debates, which is a good thing, there is now a government plan for adaptation, that's another good thing. But people continue to perceive adaptation as the admission that they failed to mitigate enough. And we need to realize that the impacts of climate change that we'll experience in our lifetime have nothing to do with our own emissions, depend on the emissions from the past, depend on the emissions from the others. And therefore, this discrepancy across time and across space is still poorly understood. I hear a lot of discourses by politicians or by activists who keep saying that if we don't do this, if we do not act, then there will be a lot of disasters coming into France. If we don't act now, it will cost zillions of euros or of dollars. I'm like, the thing is, this is scaring people and you're hoping that by scaring them, that will prompt them to act. But the problem is that there is this discrepancy between people's behavior, between what they do and the impacts of climate change that they will suffer. Greta Thunberg will also be affected by the impacts of climate change. And this discourse that insists very much on the risk associated with inaction works very well for public health policy. You shouldn't smoke because if you do, then you will be exposed to lung cancer, to a cancer of your own lungs, not to the cancer of some lungs you don't know in the far future. And with climate change, that doesn't work, which is the reason why I think that we need to insist on the immediate benefits of action. Why is it interesting for us to act? And I think this is something important that we need to develop around adaptation as well.
Yeah, and I think one part of that is demonstrating how are the changes impacting people now. Like, for instance, I think in Paris, we are seeing now the impact of the policies that have been led by the past 10 years. And I think when people sees it, then they are also buy in more into what's happening.
You will only buy in something that you've experienced, something that you've seen.
The experience, exactly.
We are all St. Thomas.
Yeah. You mentioned the people who have a little bit less maybe institutional power. So how do we make sure that those people with less institutional power, like youth, migrants, low-income populations, are not just consulted, but meaningfully involved in shaping regional plans? So for instance, for projects like Pathway to Resilience, they're now going to design their plan to come to resilience, to climate resilience. They're going to do it in co-design with the population. But how do we make sure, how do regional actors make sure that this is not just like a consultation, but a co-design process?
That is very important. We've conducted a few years ago a research project that was called MISTY that looked in particular at the contribution of migrants towards sustainability in cities. There are lots of studies about, the cultural benefits of immigration, the social benefits, the economic benefits of immigration. We looked at the sustainability benefits of immigration, and there are lots of things that we can co-design with migrants, where migrants can actually raise awareness also about issues that affect them. That has to do with transportation network, that has to do with the renovation of buildings, and very often this will touch upon both mitigation and adaptation. We have a fantastic NGO here in France, which is called Banlieue Climat, so climate suburbs, so to say, which is about, of course, working with youth in the suburbs, many of them are of immigrant descent, and making sure that they can become actors of their own adaptation and mitigation policies, making sure that they can train other youth in the suburbs, and so that they are not just consulted, but that they become actors of their own adaptation policies.
I wanted also us to talk a little bit about the role of subnational governments, because we see the world we are in today with a lot of national governments that are kind of going backward on climate, at least in some countries in Europe and elsewhere. The subnational governments are leading about 90% of adaptation measures in Europe. And why do you think regions and local actors are becoming the drivers now of climate resilience?
Because the important stuff is done at the local level. National governments focus on bullshit, on symbolic controversies that are about, raising the market share of the party, which is about buying airtime so that you can develop your rant about this or that. I'm shocked to see that in so many countries, national governments bother about meaningless stuff. And yet what I see on the ground is that the stuff that really matters is actually conducted by local government who do not bother so much about ideology and symbolic gestures and all of that, but who genuinely care about the well-being of their population. And when you are a mayor or an elected official at the local level, if you genuinely care about the well-being of your citizens, whether you're left-wing or right-wing, it doesn't matter. Actually, the policies you will implement are policies policies that will make sense and that will improve the well-being of your residents. And of course, adaptation policies are a very example of that. I don't see any real difference when it comes to adaptation policies or to climate policies in general between cities that are governed on the left wing or on the right wing. Most mayors actually that who genuinely seek to care about their people, they do the right things. Governments don't.
And so what are the main challenges that regional or local governments face when they're trying to lead on climate adaptation?
Funding. Many of them lack funding. Many of them have plenty of good ideas, but many of those ideas remain prototype or, small lab experiments. And obviously, what is important is to put those initiatives on a larger scale. But for that, you will need funding. And typically, local governments lack funding, which is the reason why we need to be creative and to find ways to stimulate private savings, private investment. And this is also the reason why it is important that local governments find inspiration in each other. Look at what's being done in the city next to you. Why don't you do the same in your city?
And one of the things that is specific to the Pathway to Resilience project that we laid at Climate-KIC is that the regions are going to work with one another. They're going to learn from one another. They're really going to collaborate. Thinking about climate adaptation strategies, how can European regions collaborate better together?
I think there are many instruments that exist already at the European level, Interreg, FEDER, that are seeking to make regions cooperate together. Those funds are underused in some countries. Typically in France, these funds are underused. And I think they should be reinforced. I think we should also foster these twinning of cities or of regions. When we were younger, you might remember these cultural twinnings. And basically the idea was that two cities would learn from the culture and folklore of each other. And of course, that was nice. I think that now we should think of those climate twinnings or adaptation twinnings. What can cities learn from each other? Cities potentially facing similar challenges on different continents or in different regions. I think this is something that we should encourage. And then there is also a European responsibility, I think, to foster regional policy. When it comes to sharing electricity, sharing transportation networks, a lot of that still needs to be implemented at the European level. When you live near a border, typically if you want to cross the border, you need to change bus or to change train. There are lots of things to do in that regard.
Yeah, and I think the twinning part is really interesting because in the EU missions on cities, so that's the Net Zero Cities program, that is exactly what they're doing. So for instance, like 2-3 cities working on retrofitting building, they're going to visit one another, learn from one another, and all of the 112 cities will benefit from the learnings from the other. That doesn't mean that they're going to be able to replicate completely because you have to adapt, obviously, to the context.
We learn so much when we look at what the others are doing.
Exactly, and we're doing the same. It's going to be the same with the adaptation project, because we recognize that you cannot start from zero every time that you start somewhere. So I think this is really interesting. Another part that I think is necessary when it comes to climate adaptation is the capacity building for regional stakeholders, right? Because it's one of the first thing you need to tackle. If people are not trained with the skills that are needed to lead like those climate adaptation strategies, it won't work. So what are some of the most common capability or resource gaps that you've seen maybe in your research project when it comes to regional actors trying to lead climate adaptation projects or strategies?
Sometimes they didn't know where to start, and they had the impression that adaptation was about rethinking or redoing everything, the whole urban planning, the whole resilience of building. And I think it would be useful to have a kind of quick guide about where to start. And sometimes they're also under the impression that if they don't do everything right at once, everything that they will be doing, it will be kind of useless, which is not the case. 3, I think we need to reinforce the issue of early alert and evacuation of citizens. Typically, cities do not think enough about evacuating their citizens. And I understand it's not easy to think of the worst when you're a city planner, but most city managers do not know exactly how to alert their citizens in case of an imminent disaster, how to evacuate them. I think that should be look at what happened in Valencia in Spain at the end of 2024, where basically a lot of people got stuck in their car and drowned in their car because they were not properly alerted, because they were not properly evacuated. So that's one thing. And 4, there is still the issue of funding, obviously, where to find the money. And this is where we need to be a bit more creative.
And so how do we make sure that programs like Pathway to Resilience not only make the resources available, but they truly empower local stakeholders? Because there is something between having the resources and actually having them being used and being used on the long term, knowing that the political time is so short. Do you have experiences from your research that can help?
Making them realize that they're vulnerable is the first step. And recognizing your own vulnerability is probably the first step on the way towards adaptation. Until recently, most people, cities, governments, at least in Europe, were very blind regarding the potential risks that they were facing. And yet there were massive floods in Germany and Belgium in the summer of 21, droughts and heat waves in France in the summer of 22. There are now municipalities losing their insurers because they're at risk and the insurer doesn't want to take the risk anymore. So it's a kind of shock, wake-up call, but still, there are still many who think that there is no need for adaptation because they'll be fine. The moment you think that, you are doomed.
Yeah, insurance is another very big topic today. How can we talked a little bit about the peer exchange and that can be happening between regions? How can this help connect local actions into something that is more coherent and transformative across Europe, right? So not only keeping it at a regional level, but making it kind of travel.
Inspiration is important. Demonstration and inspiration, look at what we are doing. The difficulty with adaptation is that it does not necessarily require international cooperation. Mitigation is nonsensical if you do not cooperate. If you're the only one doing it, that doesn't make any sense. With regard to adaptation, you can adapt on your own. You depend less on the other, which is an asset in some cases, but which can also be a hindrance towards cooperation. And yet, we have a lot to learn from each other and we should inspire each other.
And you've often spoken about climate as not just an environmental issue, but obviously a political one, not just you. But what political shifts do you think are necessary to unlock the truly transformative adaptation today?
To make it acceptable and desirable. I'm concerned that many policymakers, when they think about transition policies or about the fight against climate change, when they think about those measures, their priority is often to make them acceptable to their constituents. And I'm always like, well, guys, if the objective is to make them acceptable, the problem is that you will do very little. You will do some kind of marginal adjustments, and people will use every excuse to get rid of that, especially if that excuse is the election of a populist president in the US. I think the challenge, if we want it to be really transformative, is to make it desirable, or to make sure that this is something that the people will decide, will be wishing for. And that is the best guarantee that we can maintain those policies in the long run. We'll not get rid of climate change in the snap of a finger. Those policies we implement, we will need to maintain them in the long run, and they need to be really transformative policies. And the best guarantee we have that we'll be able to maintain those policies in the long run is, of course, the fact that we will choose them rather than that we will be imposed these policies upon us.
So I feel like we're closing a loop from the beginning of our conversation, where we were talking about the perceptions of climate change is what drive people to stay or to leave, right? And this perception is also about what you see, feel, and what you read or what you hear, right? It's about what you know about climate change and how is it portrayed in the media or in the conversation with people. And now we're talking about how to make it desirable. And there is a lot of work that we need to do in the way we communicate about climate. When we met first time, 13, 14 years ago, I think you were not as much a public figure as you are today. Now, so many media in France invite you to talk about climate change. I think it is because climate change is much more mainstream than it was. I really wanted to ask you, what do you feel works for your experience? You've been talking to the media and to people for many years. You've been researching this. What do you think works today when we talk about climate change? And I'm not talking about encouraging people to change the way they do things, but just we were talking a lot about municipalities and regional actors, etc. What can we do today? I've been working on climate communication for 14 years, and we don't know what works. We're really struggling. What do you see? What are you feeling out?
I don't have the pretension to know or to tell people I know what works and I know what we should be doing, and everyone, obviously, I have some experience, which is, it's was what it was. I think a lot of people feel a bit powerless in the face of the magnitude of the problem. And I see that communication is very often performative. If you tell people that we have no chance to succeed, they will not even try. They will say, well, then in that case, let's give it up. We don't have the option to give it up. And I think that we need to be at the same time realistic, and we cannot be blind about the magnitude of the impacts and the risks and the dangers associated with climate change. But we also need to show people that we can succeed. We also need to show what works. And I think that is important, and we need to demonstrate that it is possible, that it works. I also think that very often we've had a communication on climate change which was two-pronged. One was about value. With a moral discourse, we should fight against climate change, we need to do it for future generations, and a lot of people were feeling guilty, and we were playing on guilt. And I think that cannot work because obviously most people want to do the right things. I don't know many people who pollute for the sake of polluting. They pollute because their lifestyle, because their situation leaves them sometimes no other choice. And therefore, I think that we should absolutely move away from that judgmental discourse, which includes judging the rich. A lot of climate activists are blaming the rich. We are all, you and me, part of the 10% or even probably the 1% polluting the most. And sometimes that always makes me laugh when I see activists blaming the rich without realizing that they are themselves part of the wealthiest segment of the population. The second discourse on climate change that has been dominating public discourses is a discourse based on fear, insisting on the risks associated with climate change. And for quite some time, I was asked to blow the whistles, to raise the alarm about the dangers of climate change, and to tell people here is what's going to happen if we do not act. We have spoken very little about the interest of acting. Why is it in our best interest as an individual, as a society, as a community, as a country, as a continent, as a world to act on climate change? Why is it the source of economic benefits? Why is it a geopolitical asset as well? I think we need to talk about that because people will only adopt a solution, an alternative, if it brings a benefit to them. We need to speak about why we have an interest in act. And the problem is that this word of interest or of benefits is often a word that is not used in the climate discourse, and I think it should be much more used than it is.
But I think without falling into the pit of like making it, this is the wonderful, beautiful
Absolutely
future
not.
that is going to happen if we act, right? I think
we need to move away also from Disneyland, and we're not living in Disneyland.
Exactly. No, I think it's really interesting. I know you're a researcher, and I don't know how to frame the question so it doesn't sound like you're giving a lesson, but like for all of the policymakers, regional policymakers that are beginning their journey towards resilience, like is there a piece of advice or something that you haven't said yet that could help, you know?
My piece of advice, do not just fight against stuff, also fight for some stuff. And very often, a lot of young people fight against fossil fuel industries, fight against populist governments, fight against this or that company or this or that individual. And of course, that's important, but it's also important to fight for new projects that will bring benefit, fight for a new public transportation system, fight for electric batteries, fight for more recycling facilities. And if we could rejoice the same way about the opening of a new recycling facility than we rejoice over a motorway project that is being abandoned, I think that would be a great step forward.
Thank you, definitely. Yeah, I feel like maybe from an activist point of view, they feel like the joys of like the things that are happening, they're seeing it already because there is so much like marketing going on for instance, a deep climate tech and everything. They're really good at showing us how.
Do not think that this is all natural and spontaneous. It takes a lot of work to make this happen.
Definitely. We're going to close the podcast. I'm asking the same question for 3 years now, asking everyone to think about what would a just, beautiful and climate resilient future look like.
It would be a world where every individual should be free to go and settle where he or she pleases. That would be a world where the borders would be open and when our condition would no longer be determined by the place where we were born. That's an utopia at the moment, but who knows?
Thank you so much, François Gemène, for coming on How Could We? I really appreciate the discussion. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How Could We, part of our special season on climate adaptation and resilience in regions. Today we heard from François Gémen. Building climate resilience is not just a technical challenge, it's a deeply political and social one, as we've heard in this episode. So with François, we explored why capacity building is essential for regions to move beyond crisis response and toward more systemic transformative adaptation. We talked about what a just transition means in the context of adaptation and why local and regional governments are uniquely positioned to lead the way, even as national ambition stalls in some places. You'll find more information about the Pathway to Resilience initiative in the show notes. This episode is part of a wider campaign by Climate-KIC showcasing how adaptation and resilience are already being reimagined through regional leadership, participatory planning, capacity building for change. You can learn more on our website and social media. The links are in the show notes. If this conversation sparked new thinking, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with someone committing to building a more resilient and inclusive future. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thank you for listening. Bye!